Ken Lu, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Bora. Thanks for having me.
Ken, you're the author of my new favorite book, this book that we see behind us, All That We See or Seem. And as I told you before, you've become my new favorite sci-fi author alongside Andy Weir, the author of Martian and Project Hail Mary.
Thank you. That's a high honor.
So I have a million questions about the book, but before we get into that, I'd love to learn more about how you got into writing sci-fi. You were a programmer before, then you were a lawyer, then you became a full-time author. Let's hear that journey.
Well, I'm very lucky in that I had a bunch of day jobs as I was pursuing the dream of becoming a fiction writer, and I loved all of my day jobs. So I started out as a programmer, and I was very good at it. I really enjoyed making software and building products. And then during that time, as I was working at that job, I was also honing my craft in publishing. Later on, I switched over to corporate law, and I practiced as a corporate lawyer for 7 years, during which time I continued to publish and write. And then finally, for the third phase of my career, I switched over to being a litigation consultant, which meant that I was an expert witness in high-tech cases, reviewing source code, patents, trying to explain these things to judges and juries. Again, I was publishing more. At some point, maybe 5 years ago or so, my writing career, which was always a side gig, got to the point where it was big enough that I could actually consider quitting my job. And so I did. And I've been a full-time writer ever since. I will say, though, in contrast to a lot of stories you might have heard, I did not hate my day jobs at all. I enjoy them immensely. It's just that I like writing even more. But I've always kept a foot in the tech world, and that has served me well in terms of having material for my books.
Well, that's great because that gives us very realistic sci-fi books like the one that I just read. So let's dive into it. As soon as I started reading it, just a couple of chapters into it, I went to my wife and said, this book is what the future is really going to be like. Like, I'm getting product ideas as a product builder myself from reading the book. So immediately I'm interested in learning about, like how you're thinking about just this, how do we call it? 5 minutes into the future. It's not too far into the future, but it's a near future world. You're imagining some new tech that's very plausible. Even today, it feels like, or maybe next year or in a couple of years. So how do you come up with these ideas? Is it based on your programming background, or how do you do your research about these?
I mean, I talk to a lot of startup founders and people who are building these products right now. So obviously, I'm very much inspired by their real life work. I do also read a lot of papers in the field. I mean, this is an amazing moment in the history of our species. Typically, people think of science as being ahead of technology. You develop some basic science, and then the engineers figure out how to apply it. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the engineers figure out how to build something, and then the science has to catch up because we built something and it works, but we're not entirely sure why or how it works. And this is one of those moments. The success of the transformer architecture and these large data-driven models, the success has been wildly beyond theoretical predictions. And people are in disagreement as to why these models are as successful as they are. And so this is a super exciting moment, trying to figure that out. And I love reading papers and trying to imagine myself how the technology can be applied. And also, because I do look into a lot of different applications, I'm not focused exclusively on the large language models, which are sort of in the news all the time. But there's a lot more than that. Machine learning is a huge field, and there's a lot of amazing advances all over the place. So it's very exciting to talk to people and to think about what the future can be like. It's one of the most exciting speculative of moments in my life, honestly.
So I want to get more specific about these. So our hero in the book is Julia Z, and she's a hacker of sorts, and she uses some technologies that I was fascinated with. She has this custom AI called Talos, right? She has sense pins. She has some visual glasses. And could you kind of explain to us, like one by one, like what these things are and how they work?
Yeah, absolutely. So Julia Z is an anti-establishment hacker, somebody who is very interested in the ethics and the ethos of technology, but not so much the institutionalization of technology. So what that means is she's very interested in personal control of data and the personal sovereignty over data. These are very important concepts to her. For a lot of us who are very interested in the promise of AI, we're often sort of held back by fear that we'll lose control over our data because the interest of the large cloud companies and individual users are not always aligned. In fact, I would say often they're not aligned. And so that's one of those issues that Julia Z deals with. So fundamentally, Julia Z's personal computing paradigm can be described as basically data sovereignty. She has a lot of control over her own data, and she's very interested in controlling that data. The core of her data system is what I call a tensor bank. A tensor bank is basically a very powerful piece of AI specialized hardware, portable computing hardware. So think of it as a very powerful smartphone, but without any of the tracking hardware. It's a powerful bit of compute that you can take with you to run these powerful models locally under your own control. This device, it's called a tensor bank, obviously, in honor of tensors, sort of the key mathematical core of machine learning in the modern age. She carries this piece of hardware with her, and to it are connected a bunch of other bits of hardware. So one of them is a sense pin. The sense pin is essentially a very small bit of jewelry that she wears, which offers the tensor bank access to the external world. So there's cameras, there's microphones, various other bits of sensing technology that gives her personal AI a awareness of the situation she's in. She also wears these augmented reality glasses, similar to the augmented reality glasses that are out there now. They're called fusion vision glasses, and the idea being that these don't just present virtual reality, but augmented reality. What they do is they enhance your perception of the external world, zooming in or highlighting bits and pieces of the external world, as well as projecting data overlay over the world, giving her immediate actionable data over whatever she sees. But the key to the whole system is Talos, her personal AI system. So what I'm imagining here is that the core model of machine learning can be applied in a way to amplify our own cognitive competence. In my vision for the world, the key bit of innovation is that machine learning can be applied not just to data out there, but to ourselves, to our own cognitive patterns, to our own behavior, to our own talents and skills, such that the AI can replicate these patterns and, in fact, enhance them. So one of the things that you'll note if you work in the creative fields or some field that has a high level of technical expertise is that you yourself follow certain patterns, and you have to sort of develop your own personal signature style to be good at it. A good author is someone who consciously develops a unique style, or I call it a unique language. Anybody worth reading, right? If you think about it, whether it's Tolkien or William Faulkner, Jane Austen, they don't write in the cliche written language of their time. They invent their own personal language, the language that is uniquely suited to telling the stories that only they can tell. What the personal AI does is to give each person an ability to reflect on their own skill and to interrogate it and to examine it, to develop it over time. I call these specialized machine learning models of your skill egolets, small egos, essentially. And Julia allows Talos to develop her own egolet as a hacker so that she can examine herself, figure out what her weaknesses are, and then enhance her own ability to do what she wants and to do what she's good at even better. It's a self-reflective model of examining what you do and trying to get better at it. And so this is a model that's very familiar to people who understand deliberate practice as the key to improvement, right? If you're learning to play an instrument, if you're learning to write, if you're learning to be an artist, if you're learning to program, learning to speak a language, you have to deliberately practice. You can't just practice blindly. You have to examine what you're doing and then try to improve in a specific way. And I can see AI being a really powerful way for you to do that, for all of us to do that, but only if you can have control over your own data. And Julia is a little different from everyone else in the book in that she is extremely conscious about data sovereignty, and then I think that's what allows her to do what she does so successfully compared to a lot of the other people in the book. I'll pause there. That's sort of the basics.
Yeah, so that's incredible. So like a lot of these technologies, so the SenseSpin, I immediately think of OpenAI acquiring Johnny Ive's company, and I feel like what they're going to come up with could be something like a SenseSpin that I don't
Probably.
know, along those lines. And the glasses that you mentioned, we already have them, right? I actually just bought my Meta. This is like the Meta Oakleys that they have. I haven't been able to get the ones with the display on the right lens yet. They just don't have them in Rhode Island right now. That you can only make an appointment to get a demo. But right. I'm like, so that's kind of like very similar to kind of how you're describing. So that's a product of today already. Talos to me feels a little bit, especially towards the end of the book, Julia Z finds herself in very difficult situations. And then Talos comes to the rescue some in incredible ways. And she really knows how to wield these tools that she has. So one thing I want to ask you, Ken. So she's very conscious about her kind of private data, and she's just gone above and beyond to build these custom personal AIs for her. And now I'm kind of like, I think about how much people will care about that, like in the mainstream, because right now people use ChatGPT, now memories, right? Memories going there, Claude, Perplexity, Microsoft, Google, these are kind of like the top 5, what everybody uses their AI, and everybody's adding memory right now to kind of like create this vendor lock-in where if we have their memories, they'll just use us. So then you just add more and more data into somebody else's cloud. So then what happens to personal, like how much will people care, do you think, about like, or do you think Julia Z is more like not the norm?
This is one of those questions that I don't think will have an answer in the abstract. We're going to have to see how people behave. I mean, ultimately, you can never really know how things will turn out except by watching what people actually do. But I'm pretty optimistic about the fact that people will care, and I'll tell you why. I think there's two trends that I think will end up making people care. One of them is the inevitable conflict between skilled workers and their employers, right? So what I mean is this. Over time, as AI gets adopted, there's going to be a conflict between employers and skilled workers. Employers will want AI use to basically trap as much of the employee expertise within the business as possible. In other words, employers will have an incentive to get employees, skilled employees, to essentially train the AI models so that the employer will retain their skill even when the employees leave, or make it so that the employees can't leave. Employees, on the other hand, will want data sovereignty over their own skills so that the employer may have the use of them while they're there, but not over time. In other words, you can sort of see the possibility of employee's skill becoming a kind of IP, and there will be a conflict over the employer and the employee over who gets to control it. I think individual people will care about that. They will want to retain their own skills. I mean, let me give you a very concrete example. Right now, lawyers, when they move between firms, will often carry form documents with them. These form documents are often incredibly important because the form documents crystallize and embody the skills they learned on their jobs. These clauses are negotiated in order to accomplish certain things. And so now they have a bank of these clauses that they take with them from firm to firm. You could imagine something similar to that being put into, a firm's AI, and employees who leave will have no ability to take that with them. This will drastically make employees less attractive to employers if they're not able to take this sort of personal skill that they acquired over time with them. And I think programmers, I think lawyers, I think skilled workers of all stripes will care about that. They will want to maintain control over their own skill. They will not want to have their employer basically hold their skill hostage. So that's one part of it. I think people will care. When it comes to money and the ability to make to earn a living, people do care about that. The other part that I think people will care about is just knowing that the interests of cloud companies are not necessarily aligned with their own. This is something that people are clearly aware of. They just don't have a clear illustration of what that really means. Right now, a lot of people are perfectly happy to divulge all kinds of secrets to the various cloud-based chatbots. Many of them sort of take refuge in the idea that anonymity, is in numbers, basically, that they don't care if their data is disclosed because there's so many millions of other people who do the same thing. But a few high-profile cases of leaks of employees misusing this sort of data at the cloud companies, or just stories of data being getting people into trouble in this way. I think a few of those stories will get people to care, and moreover, the fact that there are applications of machine learning that are only possible if you allow AI to watch you all the time. I think that will matter. I mean, right now, I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable with the idea of letting AI watch everything they do on their computers or listening to them all the time. There's already a huge amount of backlash against things like Amazon's always-on, devices that listen to your conversation. I think there's already a lot of unease with that sort of thing. If people are interested in the kind of applications that are only possible if you allow AI to monitor you extensively, then I think data sovereignty is a necessity. They won't be able to really do this unless they can have that kind of control. I don't think it's the sort of thing that only a few people will care about. I think a lot of people will care about. And then fundamentally, I want to sort of offer a plan for how that could happen. I think when we talk about tech regulation, we're often focused solely on industry and commercial large cloud companies' interests. We're often legislating as though they are the only entities that matter. But, tech regulation is for people, not for companies. I think we need to pay attention to our tech policy making to focus on things like the tech commons, nonprofit uses, public interest uses, and above all, this concept of data sovereignty has to be really out there. I don't mean just privacy. Privacy, I think, is a very bad framework to look at it. It's not just about privacy or keeping it. It's really about control over your own information. That's really where the agency lies. That's where really it matters. People need to have sovereignty over their data. And I think that requires, to some extent, much more decentralized approaches to building these models, to training these models, to controlling and deploying these models. We're not there yet because compute is simply not there. But I don't believe that the model of everything being run off of the cloud, giving up all of your data to a third party who can then monitor you and then monetize you, I don't believe that's the right model for all of us. And I hope it's not.
So you talked about the future of work and skills, and I want to get more into that, but still I want to go back to the book before we save the world with the what the future is going to be like. So the dream artist concept was very interesting. about 18 months ago, when I realized AI was going to completely change the world, I was like, how are we going to differentiate ourselves as humans? And I started thinking about taste and creativity. And then I read every single book about creativity that's in the market and how people become creative. And there, I also started seeing some things about dreams, where a lot of the greats, artists, scientists, how they kind of use sleep and dreams to kind of innovate and come up with ideas. And I kind of started reading about lucid dreaming and things like that. I haven't been able to figure it out myself, like come up with like incredible ideas during my sleep. It seems like a lot of work, but it looks like there's some reality behind this, where like getting stuff done during sleep or coming up with ideas or things happening. And I heard on your NPR interview that you had special interest in dreams. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that part.
Yeah, I mean, my interest in this comes from two directions. One is consciousness research. I think understanding consciousness and what it is critical in this moment. Not only because we're building AI and we're nearer than ever to building our own form of consciousness. And if we don't understand what consciousness is, we will not be able to tell when we've done it, right? That's why there's some debates over whether these models are even on the path to consciousness or not. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that there's, we're advancing apace in terms of understanding what the brain does. We are nearer, again, than ever in terms of doing brain preservation or uploading, whatever you want to call it. Again, what are we really doing here? Are we trying to sustain and continue consciousness on a different substratum? And if so, how will we know when we've succeeded? So understanding consciousness is very critical to me. And dreams as a form of altered consciousness is incredibly important to that study. So that's one piece of it, right? The other piece of it is dreams historically have been such an important part of the human experience, right? If you go back and look at history, the dreams of leaders have been interpreted. A lot of religious experiences involve dreams or begin with dreams. And yet in the modern world, right, in the last century or maybe half a century or so, we have relegated dreams to an afterthought, right? We no longer take dreams seriously, and I think this is a mistake. The artist and writer Ursula K. Le Guin used to say that the collective unconscious is where artists go to actually find their work. We go into the collective unconscious, into dream country, and return with these visions, which we then try to share with the rest of the world. These visions are often indescribable and impossible to pin down in words, which is why we artists try to say with words what cannot be said in words. Essentially, we are trying to tell you our dreams, but in a way that's actually interesting, because most of the time you hear someone describe their dream, it's incredibly boring. So I do think dreams are incredibly important, not just in the sense of literally dreaming when you're sleeping, but also daydreams, also just letting your mind wander and see what pops up. These are all the moments when you're idle, when you're not being productive, are the moments when you're most human. Because remember, we live as humans in order to be able to do what we want to do, not to make a living, but to do the things we really want to do, whether that means achieving a flow state because we're trying to realize something from our minds that's incredibly beautiful, or when we're just dreaming, when we're trying to acquire the visions that we will then try to realize with our skills. These are the two modes of being human that we care about the most: the flow state of building visions and the dream states where we're actually acquiring visions. So to me, they're both equally important to what it means to be human, and we need to focus on those things.
Mm-hmm. So you said what it means to be human. So your book poses a question: when AI can mimic our art, our voice, our dreams, who are we then? And how do we personally think about human authenticity in a world of digital doubles? Do you see the next decade of AI as one that amplifies our human creativity and meaning, or one that risks hollowing it out?
I'm a big believer in optimistic views of technology, and then I think historically my optimism has been borne out, right? So every major technological advance in terms of replicating human craft has posed a threat to human creativity, but ultimately humans have been able to actually find new avenues. So let me just tell you, one of the most recent examples, the invention of photography, right? The camera, as an invention was quite threatening to visual artists because if your craft is capturing reality, mimesis, here comes a machine that can do it in a way that seems better than humans ever could, right? What is the point of painting portraits when you can take a photographic portrait? And if you go back and read writings of the time, there was a lot of anxiety and a lot of dismissive writing about photography initially, which reflects the deep sense of anxiety. But if you observe what people did afterwards, it's really interesting, right? On the one hand, visual artists moved away from representation because essentially capturing representation became a field dominated by photography. For better or worse, the photographic portrait became the definition of what a portrait is. Artists have moved away from that. So if you observe the visual arts after the invention of photography, they became more and more abstract and more towards impressionism, abstraction, cubism, whatever, all kinds of forms of art that are emphatically not representational. So that's one reaction. The other reaction is a reaction to the lack of craft, right? Initially, the reason people were dismissive of photography was the idea that they thought there was no craft involved, right? You point the machine at something, you click a button, and that's the end of it. There's no craft to it. But that turns out to be deeply untrue, right? Over time, photographers and other artists who experiment with the camera realize that there's a huge amount of craft to this art, to the point where photography itself became a art form, and the camera allowed people to start inventing other new forms of art, like cinema. Cinema is a technological art that is not possible in the absence of this machine. So here's a piece of technology that was initially deemed to be something that would destroy human craft, right? It will hollow it out. But it actually led to an explosion in creativity in two directions. One, because humans now have moved away from the field in which the machine dominates. And two, humans have learned to wield the machine with craft to invent entirely new forms of art. I think something very similar will happen with AI. This age where AI is just generating a lot of slop, imitating human art, I think this is transitional and it's not fundamentally going to be interesting. Human artists will react in one of two ways. One is to move away from fields in which AI-generated stuff dominates. And what are those fields? I can sort of imagine the kind of day-to-day graphic design, maybe some forms of routine kind of basic design work, which we now make artists do. But maybe those kind of things that are not necessarily what we think of as creative fine art. Maybe those are not the fields in which humans will want to continue to work in. Humans will move their craft and their skill elsewhere, just as visual artists did in the wake of the camera. At the same time, I think human artists will learn how to wield AI as a tool to generate entirely new forms of art. There can be new forms of interactivity, new forms of storytelling, new forms of creating an experience using AI that human artists will have to figure out. In the same way that it took decades for the language of cinema to be developed, I think it will take a long time for human artists to figure out how do we actually use AI with craft? How do we actually guide this thing and design this thing and manipulate this thing and train this thing and deploy this thing in a way that it becomes a tool that expresses human values and human visions rather than just something that babbles along. And then finally, I'm optimistic for a third reason, which is much more speculative, but I think fundamentally interesting, which is I don't think AI today is particularly creative or intelligent. It is wildly more successful than people ever predicted it. But fundamentally, a lot of AI generated art is just bad. When they are interesting, it's usually because the human doing the prompting has done something incredibly clever, and there's something very potent about the fact that it is done with a machine. So one example is, I saw this exhibit recently whose name escapes me, but basically it's an artist prompting AI to generate these images of impossible inventions. Or maybe the AI misunderstood the artist's instructions and created these inventions that are just not possible. And these are very haunting, beautiful images. They look like renderings of something that could exist, but they don't work. They fundamentally don't work. You look closely and you're like, this doesn't make any sense. And there's something beautiful about a machine trying to interpret a human's instructions in a misunderstood way and creating these monstrosities or wonderful things that could never exist. There's something very beautiful there. So I think there's something really potent about the possibility of AI being a partner in this sort of human creativity dance. So the third possibility I think of is today's AI is not terribly intelligent, but that may not always be the case. In the future, if we have some AI that has achieved some form of consciousness or has some sort of meaning-making capacity, then you can imagine this AI actually doing interesting work with us as a real partner. I mean, we are the only intelligent species that we know of who are capable of doing this kind of thing that I'm talking about. But that may not be true always. It's possible that someday AI will, in fact, be able to have its own consciousness and its own creativity, its own meaning-making drive. In that case, it will be amazing to have a conversation with AI and then to create things together that are not possible in the absence of either of us. So that's the third reason I'm optimistic. But I'm fundamentally very hopeful in the idea that humans who have always been able to either move away to discover new realms of craft or learn to wield the machines to practice their craft. We're not going to be hollowed out because this is what we do. We are creatures of who delight in making meaning. We're creatures who are compelled to make art. We make art not because we're forced to, but because we want to, and that's not going to change.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the future of work and jobs and skills. So, my professional network, I see a lot of people, especially in the fields of programmers, engineers, designers. You see all these layoffs, losing their jobs, and they're kind of depressed, a little bit paralyzed about what to do. I think about my 5-year-old. What kind of job can he get when he grows up? So, and kind of thinking about me, it's so hard to predict. Everything is moving so fast. What's going to happen in 2 years versus 5 years versus 10 years. It could be that AI and robots will do every single jobs. And if you listen to guys like Elon Musk, and maybe there will be something like universal basic income type of a thing. Maybe there's no money, concept of money, just money comes from somewhere. We just kind of survive without working. I don't know, that's one extreme, obviously. Like, what kind of new jobs do you imagine emerging in that world? Or have you thought about, kind of thought far enough to kind of get to a point where maybe there won't be jobs for humans anymore, but there will be money anyway, or they'll be fine somehow?
I mean, I think fundamentally I want to ask a different question, which is, why do we think jobs are required? I mean, jobs have not always existed, and why do we assume that jobs are always required? Jobs serve a variety of functions today for humans, and we sort of mix them up in a way that I don't think is necessarily helpful. So remember, our hunter-gatherer ancestors spend maybe 16 hours a week to make a living, quote unquote. The rest of the time they spend in other ways. I mean, anthropologists tell us that the idea of working 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week for a living is very modern and very much not the norm, quote unquote, right? It's in the history of our species. This is something that essentially only came in after the agricultural revolution. That is not necessarily how our species was meant to live. So there's no reason to think that spending a lot of hours to make a living is required for our own, as a biological imperative. It doesn't make any sense. The other point I want to make is that jobs often serve for us beyond just as a way to make a living, as a way to establish our identity. When someone says, I'm a lawyer, it doesn't mean that they make money. It doesn't only mean that they make money that way. It also is part of their identity. their sense of self is very tied up with the value that society places on that kind of work. So, given that is the case, we need to think about, let's just imagine the worst case scenario, which is somehow robots and AI is doing all the quote unquote jobs and humans have nothing to do. What exactly are we worried about? I mean, if we're worried about letting everyone make a living, we're already in a horrible situation. Lots of people are working 70, 80 hours a week and still unable to make a living. So how is preserving jobs like that helpful? It's not. If we want to solve the problem of people not being able to make a living, and if we want to solve the problem of people being poor, if we want to solve the problem of people working too hard for too little, we cannot solve that problem by preserving the status quo. We can only solve that problem by actually changing the systems that we have set in place for getting money to people. And whatever that system is, whether it's universal basic income or some other mechanism of reallocation and redistribution, we have to figure that out. But we need to figure that out regardless, because the current system is not sustainable anyway. We are already in a hellhole. Let's not imagine that somehow preserving this will magically solve our problems, right? That's one point. The other point is, it seems to me that the real issue here is a lot of the jobs that we're keeping around are meaningless. They give people a sense of self, but only in the most trivial way, right? When warehouses are deploying computer system to tell workers exactly where to go and how much time they have to go and treating them basically as robots, this is not a job with dignity. This is not a job that treats humans as humans. This is a job that reduces humans to machines. When a job tells you that your job is to simply read from a script and answer the customer in accordance with the script, the system is just using you as a voice generator. Again, it's not using you, it's not treating you with the respect that you deserve as a human. We need to find other ways for humans to employ themselves, to occupy their time, to spend their time in a way that allows them to create meaning and to have meaning. It's not right to put people into jobs where they barely are functioning better than robots and to sort of say we have solved the problem. We have not solved the problem. The real issue is a crisis in lack of meaning. So many of us are deeply depressed because jobs in the modern world often are meaningless, and we need to change that. We need to actually create opportunities for people to create meaning. These are the problems that I'm more concerned with, rather than this idea of preserving jobs as they exist. The jobs that, as they exist, are not necessarily good. We should not be afraid to actually change things, to figure out how to give people meaning and how to help them make a living. These are not problems solved by the word job.
Mm-hmm. So, it's such interesting things happening right now. People losing their jobs, and not being able to find jobs, almost forces them into entrepreneurship to try and make a living. And now it's a great time to be an entrepreneur, because using AI, you can actually build things that you could never have built in the past. So, but then what to build, right? So let's kind of think about your designing for the future, about how you prepare for your books. And I like this living in the future concept by the VC Mike Maples. He wrote in his book. Let's address the builders. Like, how can builders today, product builders or startup builders, how can they use that mindset designing for the world that's coming rather than the one that exists now? Can you give them some advice?
I would say this. I would say that you have to be very careful about what is hype and what is possible. And you have to sort of keep both in mind. In other words, I think it's possible to be too optimistic, and it's also possible to be too realistic. So here's what I mean. The whole idea of vibe coding is often misunderstood, right? So vibe coding does work, meaning where you basically tell the AI to write code for you instead of doing it yourself. For a lot of things, that actually is a net benefit. No one wants to go there and write UI code. It's just terrible. It's so draining, and it's horrific. Designing UIs is fun, but writing UI code, terrible. So having machines do that for you is a net benefit. But you can get the benefit of vibe coding only if you're already a pretty skilled programmer yourself. If you're skilled, you will be able to actually see what the machine is generating for you, understand what's happening, and to be able to say, okay, this is pretty good, I'm going to accept it. This is not good, I'm going to have to do it by hand. Like, the ability to know when to be able to use whatever the machine has done for you versus when not is incredibly important. And so if you just believe in the hype and you think it's not that important, then you're going to be in trouble. A lot of people, we've heard scandals of apps written via vibe coding that commit horrible data breaches and all kinds of security issues simply because the people who asked the machine to write the code for them didn't understand what they were doing. These are fundamental problems that still have to be solved. So it is possible to be overly optimistic in that sense, where you believe the hype and you're not really actually building the kind of sustainable business that you have to do. Now, on the other hand, it's also possible to be too realistic in the sense that you don't really understand what things are going to be. Just because AI is bad today doesn't mean it will be bad at that thing 6 months from now or 12 months from now. You have to actually keep on trying and experimenting and see what is possible and what actually is interesting. Again, I feel a lot of this stuff requires you to go out there and try and experiment and actually just use it rather than just sort of theoretically think about what's possible. It's possible to spin up all kinds of visions. As a fiction writer, I can spin up all kinds of scenarios. But if you're trying to make these things, if you're trying to make dreams come true rather than just dreaming, you actually have to do the hard work of investigating, of making sure you have learned what you need to know to be able to decide if what you're doing actually makes sense and is up to the standards that you have to set for yourself. This is not, a time where you can... The goal is not to build something cheap and quick so that you can make a lot of money. That should never be the goal. The goal should always be, are you actually satisfying a deeply felt need in our species? Are you actually serving your customers in a way that respects their dignity and their agency and allows them to dream into being who they are? You have to build things that make people more human rather than make them more into machines. I think that's fundamentally my most important piece of advice. When you're building something involving AI and when you're trying to build a tool that you think will help people, think about, does this tool allow your customers and yourself to become more human, or does it reduce them to the state of machines? If it's the former, then good, go for it. If it's the latter, I think you need to re-examine your idea.
Ken, do you vibe code some stuff yourself?
I do it actually sometimes. I write a lot of scripts for myself, and sometimes rather than writing the Python code to myself every line, I will ask the AI to do it, and then I'll examine it to see if it makes sense. And I would say quite a lot of times they do make sense, and sometimes I've learned a few tricks about the API from these machines, and they're really a lot of fun. It's definitely allowed me to learn new APIs and new libraries much quicker than I would otherwise. Although sometimes I still have to go look at the documentation to see why something isn't working exactly the way it's supposed to be. One of the things that's really annoying about some of these AI tools is that they're incredibly lazy. For a variety of reasons, these companies have to sort of minimize the amount of compute devoted to every request. So there's a tendency for these models to do the bare minimum. So oftentimes you have to examine the result and sort of think about what you're trying to do. The fact that these models are often quote unquote lazy as a result of their drive to minimize compute manifests itself in all sorts of ways. And so if you're going to rely on these tools, you have to be very careful yourself. Hallucinations, mistakes, all sorts of things pop up as a result of this drive to minimize the compute. And you have to be very, very conscious in the way that you use these tools.
Mm-hmm. Ken, so quick lightning round before we wrap up. One job that exists in your world, but not yet in ours.
It will be the Dreamweaver. That's what the artist in my story is about. So I should have mentioned this earlier, but I didn't. But all that we see or seem, what is the plot about? Well, the plot is basically about Julia Z, this hacker who was notorious years ago, but is now trying to live a quiet, obscure life in the suburbs of Boston. But her life is interrupted when this lawyer, Pierce, comes into her life and tells her, my wife, who's a famous artist, has disappeared, and you need to help me find her. The artist, Ellie, is a dream weaver. She's somebody who uses AI as a tool for her art. Essentially, what she does is she uses AI to monitor the states of her audience. And she does a performance in which she helps an audience to dream together, to go on a collective dream journey together. And she can't do what she does without AI's help, because AI allows her to monitor everyone's state and to give everyone individualized prompts to help them dream into this unified vision. So that's one idea for a job that will not exist until AI advances to a certain point. An artist who uses AI as a part of her toolkit to create works of art that we don't even have.
One piece of tech from your book you actually wish someone would build.
I would love to have Talos, my own Talos.
Me
I would
too.
love to have a powerful piece of hardware that I can control that allows me to train my own model and have control over all my data. I would love that.
One current trend in AI that worries you the most.
I would say it's this obsession with turning humans into agents for AI. What I mean by that is oftentimes when you're using a piece of tool, an AI technology, you think what you're doing is you're using AI, but almost always these companies are using the AI as a way to get you to give it more data. So, for example, by integrating a cloud AI into your life, it will now be able to see parts of the web it cannot crawl by itself. It will be able to get access to your own personal data that there's no other way for it to acquire. So essentially, these bits of AI tools they're really trying to make you into their agent to gather more data for them. I think this is a very dangerous, troubling trend, and people really need to be on guard.
Mm-hmm. And one current thing in AI that gives you the most hope?
The fact that the protein folding problem has been solved essentially by using the same machine learning techniques that power large language models. We are barely seeing the benefits of that now, and I think in the future we will see a lot more of it. This is an incredible advance in the history of the human race, that this problem of predicting protein shape based on its sequence was thought to be an unsolvable problem, or computationally simply beyond the ability of our hardware to ever handle. But we now have solved it, essentially using machine learning techniques that are very, very similar to the ones for large language models. That is wonderful. And I cannot wait for more advances like that to come about.
If you could live a day as Julia Z, what would you do first?
Probably examine my own eaglet as a writer and figure out what I'm good at, what I'm not good at, and see if the model's analysis is accurate and matches my own, and then figure out how I can improve.
So I understand, Ken, you already wrote the next book. When should we expect that?
That should be coming out probably in 2027, early 2027. 2026, I'm planning on bringing out a new collection of my short fiction called The Passing of the Dragon and Other Stories. So the next Julia Z book, which I've already finished, is going to come out in 2027, so that I have one book every year. But that's the idea.
So final question, Ken, if the movie comes out, who should play Julia Z?
Oh, that I don't know. I mean, there are so many talented actresses out there. I mean, I would love for it to be actually someone new, if that were to happen. It would be wonderful to have Julia Z be the launch pad for a new actress's career. I think that would be amazing. But whoever ends up doing it, I would be ecstatic.
Ken Liu, thank you for joining me, everyone. The book you see behind me, All That We See or Seem, incredible near sci-fi book. Everybody should read it. Thanks again, Ken.
Thank you, Bora. It was really fun.